Welcome to Journey Through Time. I'm David Olusoga.
And I'm Sarah Churchwell.
And this is the last of our three-part series on the Salem Witch Trials of the late 17th century. And last week, Sarah, you explained the wave of accusations, confessions, torture, and executions that consumed that community in Salem, Massachusetts. It was like a virus that spread from Salem village to the surrounding settlements. We are now in the autumn of 1692. In the midst of a wave of violence, of judicial violence, of executions. Where does the story go next?
So as we were saying last time, the trial's credibility was starting to falter by this point because of exactly what you just described. This sense of, can it really be this many people who are guilty of covenants with the devil?
Yeah. The scale of the accusations was making it seem unbelievable.
Yeah, because it was, right? But exactly. So, and because there seems to be no limit to it, and because respectable people were getting caught up in it, ministers were getting caught up in it, so people were starting to doubt.
Last time you were telling us about the execution of George Burroughs, a minister of the church executed publicly for witchcraft.
And Rebecca Nurse, 71-year-old pious matron whose neighbors circulated a petition declaring her innocence, and still she was executed. All of these pillars of the community cannot all be witches. So respected voices start calling out against the process. They start saying this is corrupt, and importantly, outsiders from Boston in particular, but from neighboring communities that are not caught up in the violence. They start denouncing what is happening. At the same time, there are reports of the torture and the coercion that people like John Proctor, as we heard last time, smuggled out of prison, talking about the ways that torture was being used to wring out the confessions. And of course, that also brings the proceedings under doubt. Those start to circulate. And there are mounting questions about the legitimacy of the evidence that is at the center of the courts.
This is the so-called spectral evidence.
Yeah. And it had already been a controversial decision to allow the admission of spectral evidence of the, as we were saying last time, the claim that somebody is invisibly torturing you and that can be used as a death sentence.
Yeah.
So there are obvious reasons for thinking, even in the 1690s, that is not how a courtroom trial should be conducted. And so there's growing, unease and protests against this, and people saying this spectral evidence thing, this is really, really a problem. And into this growing divide steps an unexpected figure. As we were saying before, the person who is arguing for spectral evidence is the minister Cotton Mather,
who has been sent to Salem from Boston.
They have asked him to come in as a kind of consulting minister and make sure that they're doing things in a theologically sound way. And he says, admit spectral evidence. And so basically on his authority, they did so. His father steps into the debate. His father, Increase Mather.
Because in case people can't quite get this, his father's name is Increase. That is his first name.
Yes, he is called Increase Mather.
And his son is called Cotton Mather.
His son is called Cotton Mather. And we can get into Puritan naming practices maybe in another episode. But Increase Mather and Cotton Mather continue to be incredibly famous figures in American history. Increase Mather is Cotton's father, and he actually steps into the controversy, and he comes down on the opposite side from his own son. Increase Mather is also an incredibly respected minister. He's the president of Harvard. And in October 1692, he denounces spectral evidence. He actually gives this famous statement where he says, and I think we can all agree that history is on the side of Increase Mather on this one. He says, it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person be condemned. This is the principle of the presumption of innocence, is that it would be better that guilty people escape than that one innocent person be jailed, or in this case, executed for a crime that they did not commit.
What was the effect of this intervention by Increase Mather?
Well, as you might expect, it was pretty explosive because it's father against son. But his authority was such, and I say there were already these doubts, so people are waiting for somebody authoritative to come in and say, hang on.
It is one of those scenarios where it would almost take an external authority to bring people. He just kind of
steps in and says, stop, enough. And he really turns the tide of clerical opinion, which is really important here. Because we've got to remember this is a theocracy, right? This is what we've been describing all along. So there's this merging of the legal and the theological that we're not accustomed to in our society.
No, I think we sometimes forget that these communities in colonial America they really are theocracies. There is no separation of church and state. And in some ways, the idea of there should be a separation comes from these experiences. But I mean, they are the church and the state, the church and the law merge in a way that we find very, very hard to understand.
And as you say, that's at the kind of foundation of the Puritan settlement. That's what they set out to create.
Yeah, they've traveled an ocean because they want to live in a godly, pure state with the church being at the center of absolutely everything. I mean, they want a theocracy and they've got it.
And they've got it. And now they find out what it can do when it's, out of control. And so increased Mather's statement is really important. And it meets, though, a changing public opinion. It meets a changing tide. And so within weeks, actually, the governor dissolves the special court, the Court of Oye Intermine that had been established. And that brings the executions to a halt, but not the accusations. But they're kind of dwindling now. So, and we should imagine kind of concentric circles. So they're still outside of Salem Village. There are these accusations that are going on. Historians talk about the second wave of accusations, but importantly, because that court has been dissolved, we're not seeing the mass executions now. People are getting jailed and they're getting interrogated, but the tragic consequences are starting to subside. I mean, I'm not saying it would be nice to be interrogated for witchcraft and jailed. It's still pretty bad, but you're not getting executed. But you aren't going to
be in court and then end up on the gallows.
Yeah. So that's the autumn of 1693. And by January 1693, they have convened a new court, a superior court, and this one bars spectral evidence. It says this is not evidence. And guess what? When you bar spectral evidence, cases of witchcraft collapse. And so one after another, the juries don't convict. So people are acquitted and they are sent home. So they've had a terrible ordeal, but they survive it and they're able to move on. And by the spring of 1693, all of the remaining prisoners had been pardoned and released.
And at this point, I guess people can look back and take stock of what's happened.
Yeah. There's a mounting sense of horror very, very quickly. This is not a situation where hindsight is very necessary, because in the 12-month period, effectively, around 200 women and men had been accused of witchcraft. As we said last time, there were over 400 accusations that were legally lodged. It's a little bit messy because there were accusations that weren't actually put down in the record, so there were almost certainly more accusations overall. But we know around 200 women and men were accused. 19 were executed in this 6-month period. One pressed to death, as we said last time.
So crushed with stones as part of an attempt to extract a confession through effectively torture.
Yeah, well, a plea actually in Giles Corey's case, because he wouldn't even enter a plea because he just wasn't going to take part in this process. Yeah. But he was tortured to death. And at least 5 died in jail. Some of them died of
disease.
Or the trauma of it, right? Yeah. If they were frail. And possibly some of them died under the physical conditions of torture as well. We don't know for sure, because as we saw with John Proctor's petition, people were being tortured in jail. So we don't know to what degree that might have contributed to the deaths in jail as well. And many others were held for months, including the 4-year-old girl, Dorcas Good, who, as we said last time, was so traumatized by the experience that she never recovered and could never care for herself afterwards.
So the momentum that has led to all of these deaths, all of this torture, that now recedes. And so I guess people can start to try to reassess and work out what the hell has just happened.
And they start doing that very quickly because so many people were caught up in it and so many people took part in the accusations. But now we've got a kind of reversal where you've got somebody like Increase Mather coming in and saying this was wrong. We haven't ended the paradigm of sin that kind of kicked the whole thing off. So you now have to account for the fact that you've maybe done something really, really bad. And that in the efforts to purge your community of the devil, you've actually fallen on the wrong side of God.
So the accusers now have to answer for their actions.
They have to worry about their souls now. So recantations start to multiply and accelerate. So it isn't just the case that in retrospect, later generations said they were mistaken. The accusers, the women themselves, and the judges who were involved, as time passes pretty quickly, actually, they start recanting, saying we got it wrong, or explaining why they falsely confessed. So we were talking last time about my sort of namesake in the record, Sarah Churchwell.
It was a 25-year-old girl who accused her her boss, the man she worked for, of being of witchcraft.
And he was executed. So he was hanged on the testimony of her and others, and she recanted. She said she lied against her master because she was threatened. So she said that her confession was coerced out of her while she was being confessed, so that she was one of the coerced confessions. That the magistrates threatened her, but she didn't say whether it was physical or, what else they were going to do to her. But she said she lied. And others of them stood up and said they lied. Some said they got it wrong. Some said they were misled. Some said the devil made them do it. But some stood up and said, I lied. And Sarah Churchwell was one of them who said, I lied because I was threatened. In 1697, so just 4 years after the trials wound down, one of the judges involved, a famous judge, Samuel Sewall, stood in a Boston church while a confession of guilt was read aloud, and he publicly asked pardon of God and man, because you need God to forgive you now for what you've done. And that same year, several jurors also signed statements of repentance. They said they had been deluded by false testimony. So they just said, I fell for it.
But they'd been so sure that they had sent people to their deaths. And it is amazing how quickly this turns around, how that absolute confidence in what they're doing ends with repentance and recantation.
Yeah, within 4 or 5 years. Other accusers admitted, like Sarah Churchwell, that they had been pressured to do it. And a lot of them said that they did it to avoid hanging. So there were people who stepped up and said, I did it for as you were saying earlier, David, it was a rational reason for doing it.
They did it to save themselves.
They did it to save themselves.
I mean, that places it within a more understandable historical phenomenon.
Yeah.
Because in the world of kangaroo courts and show trials, people have stood up in courts and pointed fingers and denounced people because it's them in the gulag or them in front of the firing squad.
Yeah.
If they don't. And it takes away the sort of supernatural element.
And the mysterious, the enigmatic parts of the story, which we'll come back to. But exactly. So this part of it, as you say, that gives us a rational framework.
Yeah.
We can all understand it.
And there's much about this story which is so difficult to understand from the 21st century. But that element that this was frightened people.
Yeah.
Pointing fingers and making accusations because they didn't want to be the person on the gallows. At least that makes it something that's more familiar.
Yeah, and we get that. In 1706, one of the central figures in the trials, Ann Putnam, who had been 12 and one of the, the star afflicted, as we were saying, she was 26 in 1706, and she recanted. She said, it was a great delusion of Satan that deceived me. So she says the devil made me do it.
Which in some ways, again, I mean, maybe it's understandable because the alternative that others did, which is that I did it because I was frightened.
Yeah.
That's a harder thing to say than I was deluded by the devil.
Especially if you're still looking for salvation and redemption, right? So if you want God to forgive you, then you need to be convinced that you were deluded by a greater power than yourself rather than you made a conscious choice to do the wrong thing out of fear. So there are these different reasons that people give, but very quickly the whole thing unravels. So they very quickly become aware that this terrible miscarriage of justice has taken place.
God, how do you live with this?
It's not clear. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the story, we said at the beginning that the whole story comes out of the court records and the interrogation. There's very little known about these people after the courts.
Once the court case is over, there's no one to record their words.
Yeah.
So we get the accusations and we get the moment of panic, but how they process it afterwards,
we have no way of knowing.
They're doing their years later in their private moments.
Yeah. And, historians are very familiar with the fact that in the early modern period, in times like this where the archival records are often very thin, you only encounter people in this historical period when basically they make their way into the official records usually because they do something wrong. Or because they get married, they die, they get, they're born. So you get those kinds of official records. But then otherwise it tends to be because you find yourself in court.
Yeah. You encounter authority.
Yeah. That
means your voice is relevant for a day.
Yeah.
And suddenly we hear you.
Yeah, exactly. And so whether that's in the church or in the legal courts, but otherwise there aren't very many traces that a lot of these people left.
So we don't know really the answer to that question of how they lived with themselves.
So we know that Ann Putnam did get married. A few of the other young women involved got married. A few of them left Salem.
Do we know what happened to Sarah Churchwell?
Again, we don't know very much about Sarah Churchwell, but actually Sarah Churchwell does pop back into the record in exactly the way we were saying. She pops into the record because she gets into trouble. So she went back to the Maine frontier and she was arrested there for fornication.
So premarital sex.
So in the Puritan paradigm, that means premarital sex. But she married the person that she was arrested with.
Which kind of makes it okay-ish.
I mean, surely to us it does, right?
Yeah.
So she married her lover, basically. So I hope they had a nice life. She had a rough time, and I hope it worked out for her. So we don't know very much about what happened to the people afterwards. We do know what the colony of Massachusetts did to a certain extent, because they decided that this had been a miscarriage of justice. And so 20 years later, in 1711, Massachusetts reversed the convictions. So for all of the people who had been found guilty but not executed or had, confessed as part of their process, they all had their convictions reversed. People's civil rights were restored. They offered financial restitution to the families that had been destroyed. It's during this process, for example, that Dorcas Good's father testified that she had lost her reason, that she had been so traumatized by the experience that she couldn't look after herself.
And people needed restitution financially because if you confessed, you might avoid the gallows, but you forfeit property, don't you?
Potentially. This plays out in erratic ways because, as we've been saying, land disputes are at the center of some of this. So there are various ways in which, people were seizing land. Inheritance plays into it, but it's also, of course, that you lost the breadwinner. I mean, you lose, he's a landowner and so the families have recompense coming to them because they've lost their ability to look after themselves.
Yeah. By 1711, so 20 years later, people are looking back and not just realizing that this was wrong, but trying to make up to some of the victims, trying to address some of the harm that's been done.
Yeah. And remember, as you say, it's just 20 years later. The accusers were mostly young girls, so nearly all of them are still alive.
Yeah.
And we didn't really talk enough about the fact that it wasn't just young women doing the accusing. There were men who also did some accusing as well as men being accused. But by and large, it was this, as we said, the majority of the accusations came from this one group of young women. So there's, as far as we know, I think all of them were still alive, or most of them were. But the reckoning doesn't end with that either, because this is this terrible blight on, the history of Massachusetts. And it became so famous for all kinds of reasons. So even into the 20th century and into the 21st century, there's been a reckoning that's been ongoing. So in 1957, there was an official apology by the state of Massachusetts. And in 2001 and 2022, there were exonerations that kind of cleared whoever's name hadn't been fully cleared. So these kind of official acts of restitution to acknowledge that there was a historical wrongdoing.
It's symbolic, but powerful.
It is. And it's important. It's important to recognize, I think, a miscarriage of justice on this scale.
I mean, people sometimes say, what's the point of apologizing when people are long dead? But it's because they're still in the records as having been guilty of witchcraft.
Yeah, exactly. So it is, of course, it's worth doing. But all of that really brings us up to the big question, right? And the big question of the Salem Witch Trials is, what on earth happened?
Yeah. How on earth could this have taken place?
And to this day, there is no agreed explanation for the girls' afflictions.
I've struggled throughout to find a kind of shorthand to describe what's going on. Is it a panic? We talked about using that word. Is it an hysteria? Is it a terror? It's really difficult to think about what is the label to attach to this.
This is why a lot of historians now settle for crisis, because it's a nice neutral word.
Yeah.
Because it is difficult to know. We don't know what caused the girls' afflictions in the first place. We also can't really account for the way that the symptoms spread. Just now, we've been talking about the fact that many of them stood up and said that they lied under pressure, but not all of them. And we were talking about the fact that there were really severe physical symptoms that were part of the initial outbreak. And this very much continues to be at the heart of historians' questions, and nobody's sure. But there are some prominent theories. So you've been talking about hysteria and, rightly problematizing it because, of course, it's a word with a misogynistic history. But that was the first explanation for a long time, for centuries, really. Through the 20th century, the earliest kind of assumption was that the girls were hysterical. So they were irrational, they were delusional, they were, over-emotional, they were crazy women. So Salem is a case of mass female madness. Or they're liars. They're all liars. Every single one of them, as John Proctor believed. So it's either female madness or it's female trickery, female deceit. So basically, misogyny is your first explanation, is blame the women. But, women are terrible is not an explanation I'm going to sign up for. But it also doesn't explain why men were also among the accusers.
Yeah, it doesn't work in lots of ways.
It doesn't solve any. It doesn't really solve any of the important problems. So there are lots of other explanations that are put forward. Since the 1970s, people have been pointing out the factionalism at the heart of the story, as we've been talking about it.
This was a deeply divided community.
Yeah, and it was historians who pointed this out, who through interpretation analysis said, hang on, I see a pattern here, and that there are these deep divisions and that the outbreak follows the allegiances of those divisions.
Those who are accused are from one faction, and those who do the accusing are from the other.
Yeah. So, for example, Rebecca Nurse's family land lay on some of the disputed borders between the two factions. So this is prominent in some of the early explanations here to say that that's a clear reason why she might be victimized in this panic in an effort to get your hands on her land.
And that's just typical for any scenario when you can denounce people and settle scores in a moment of panic. It's what happens in totalitarian states. It's what's happened in Nazi Germany. If somebody has a piece of property or a house or something, you're in a legal dispute with them, or you just don't like them. Any society built on denouncement just invites these sorts of score-settling events to happen.
Yeah. If you've got a grievance, they've given you a ready-made mode of vengeance.
Yeah.
For a lot of people, they're going to take it. As convincing as this theory is to explain who got targeted and why they got targeted and why the prosecutions persisted, it still doesn't explain why the girls' bodies convulsed in the first place.
No, it explains a lot of the dynamics of what happens once this crisis is up and running, but it doesn't explain how, from Samuel Parris's household, this crisis began in the first place.
So what causes the outbreak? So in the 70s, there was briefly a popular theory that it was a physical response to ergot poisoning, to a mold, to moldy rye, because it can produce convulsions and hallucinations. So they thought there was a medical explanation.
And there are cases of people eating food that is contaminated in this way, and it creates a sort of almost like a drug-like state, and people behave very strangely. It has happened.
It sounds plausible. And to have a medical explanation is the rational explanation that we're all looking for.
But the problem is, I guess I like it because it's rational.
Yeah. But it doesn't.
I'm not a 17th century Puritan.
Well, there's that. But also it just doesn't account for too much of what happens. Again, there are symptoms in the record that aren't consistent with this kind of poisoning, that not everybody had the same symptoms. It doesn't account for the viral spread of the accusations.
Or that it lasts over a year.
Yeah. And there are parts of where the outbreak occur that don't have the grain stored and whatever. So.
And these sort of events that are caused by ergot poisoning, they're short. This is month after month.
Yeah. And spreading. So that's been discredited for a while, but it's worth mentioning people looking for these kinds of, physiological medical explanations. In the 1980s, feminist historians started situating Salem within the larger revision of the reading of the history of witch hunts as a function of misogyny, as a long process in which, men were disciplining unruly women. And we were talking about that in the earlier parts of the story. So Salem can very much be situated within that history to a certain extent. So as we said, there were, particularly in the beginning, it was women who were outcasts or who were nonconforming or spoke publicly. They were disproportionately accused.
But not all of them.
But not all of them. And again, it doesn't explain why men were also accused and indeed executed.
Yeah. And women who are high standing in the community, who are pious, who don't fit into that unruly women who need to be disciplined mindset.
Yeah. And it's young women who are the accusers, which is central to the story, who are being listened to. Yeah. So that's a reversal of that, standard patriarchal sexist hierarchy, right? So it doesn't fit a lot. So again, misogyny plays into it. Of course it does, but it doesn't solve it. It isn't the explanation. Then we get into the ones that are a little bit more complicated, which are about the relationship between the mind and the body. So in the 80s and 90s, the theory arises that it's what people often refer to as psychosomatic, when psychological stress or trauma converts into physical symptoms. So the symptoms are real. The symptoms are produced by psychological stress or trauma.
So would the argument in that theory be that because these young girls believed that the devil could possess them, that their bodies sort of followed their mind, and the physical symptoms were real because they really believed it.
Well, it's a kind of precursor to, and we'll get to this because you mentioned it earlier in the story, and it does come into it. It's a kind of precursor of PTSD, the way that we can have physical symptoms of mental trauma and stress.
Because, of course, the mind and the body aren't separate.
Exactly. So, and we understand that stress can have physical symptoms. I mean, there are really, there are everyday versions of that where your neck gets tense or whatever, right? So we know these things are very mundane, and there can be much more complex versions when the stress is very severe. So one possibility is that the girls were under some kind of shared stress or some kind of shared trauma, and that it led to these physical symptoms. But there's another option that's a kind of subset of this, which is that there's an illness now that doctors call, and this is quite, you and I are not doctors of that kind, so this has a very technical name, but they call it socially mediated neurological illness. And as I understand it, but again, we'll have to get doctors, coming in and correcting me if I've got this wrong, but that the specific symptoms, contortions, choking, muteness that they were complaining of actually can come out of suggestibility. And that suggestibility is very strong in small communities. And basically, it's not just that your individual, as I understand it, it's not just that your individual stress or trauma gives you individual physical symptoms, but that fear and suggestion are passing through a community and they're triggering a real physical reaction that spreads through the group. And this has been apparently witnessed and evidenced in other situations. So the attention from the court makes it a kind of social performance under stress that are socially contagious. I feel like there's a whole episode that could be done. I mean, I feel like we need to go dig into socially mediated neurological illness. I've been trying to kind of get to grips with it as a possible explanation. I think it's fascinating. It still doesn't explain some of the aspects of the story, although it's plausible for some of it. It doesn't explain the factional spread. It doesn't explain the viral spread of confessions. Those have other causes, as we've been saying. And that brings us to one of the most popular theories, which is, which we've been referring to in terms of PTSD.
Which is, I mean, if I can put it simply, a lot of these people were already quite fucked up because of what they've been through.
Yeah, exactly.
Because this was a brutal time. They're living on a frontier and they've lived through wars.
Yeah, they're traumatized. They're already traumatized. So many of the women who were accusers had lived through the wars on the frontier with Native peoples that we've been talking about, King Philip's War and King William's War. And some of them, Mercy Lewis, had been taken captive.
Yeah, the accounts of what happened to her are pretty horrific. It's hard to believe that she would be unaffected by what she had been through.
So she was taken captive and she witnessed a fellow captive be dismembered.
And this is in wars with the indigenous Native American peoples whose land was being taken. And so this was a period of counter raids where indigenous people were attacking settlements. And they were capturing the settlers, and there was a great deal of violence on both sides. But a lot of these young women were refugees, and they refugeed into Salem. They poured into Salem from the main frontier, and they brought these stories of violence and horror and captivity that shaped the imagination of the community around them, who were all afraid that the Native people might come and attack them next. So this is what some people call invasion psychosis.
Mm-hmm. Exactly that. And they have mapped their fears onto Native people. Remember, we've been talking about Puritans. They literally believe that Native people are savages, that they are infidels, that they are themselves the devil's emissaries. Mercy Lewis repeatedly, when she talked about the devil, seeing the devil in her testimony, she repeatedly cast him in the shape of an Indian. She said he looked like an Indian. So the theory, basically, and this is really associated with the story of Mary Beth Norton, is that the Salem crisis brings frontier trauma into the kind of Puritan mindset and starts to see the devil in the shape of Indians everywhere. It explains a lot about the narrative they created. And it can partially explain the symptoms if it is PTSD. It doesn't account for every accuser, though, because a lot of them were not survivors of frontier violence. And again, it doesn't account for that viral spread. If each of them was just traumatized individually, then it doesn't explain how it spreads across.
And the fact that none of these theories explain every aspect of what happened, I mean, it suggests that there is no single explanation, that this was a coming together of a range of factors, it also suggests that maybe we'll never know.
Indeed. And as we've been saying, not all of it requires a theory. There are certain, rational parts of the story as well. So the historical consensus is that it's probably all of the above.
Yeah.
It's what's called a synthesis, right? It's a little bit of everything. And, we don't talk about history as having a single cause. Big historical events very rarely have one single isolated cause. So a series of pressures create a perfect storm. So trauma plus faction, plus gender, plus coercion, plus the belief systems, all of those come into force because the court decides to have this permissive evidentiary structure to let spectral evidence into the court. And that combination of everything is probably what caused it. But as you're saying, we might never know.
Yeah. But what is absolutely certain, and what was kind of obvious really quickly afterwards, was that this was an event so shocking, so remarkable, that it was never going to be forgotten. That the reason we have all of these theories is because people have spent the last centuries trying to work out what the hell happened, how on earth this could have happened. It's also inspired artists. It's been the focus of plays, of films, because it is such an unusual event. So in some ways, the next part of the story is the legend of Salem and what happened in the witch trials, and how that's in some ways muddied the waters about what happened and why it might have happened. So maybe we should take a break there and come back and discover, how it is that this event becomes so famous and so infamous. Welcome back. I mean, Sarah, when I think about Salem, I have to think about Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, and the way in which this idea of Salem and the idea of the witch trial and the witch hunt has become a kind of metaphor for everything that happens later. It's used time and time again. It's used for the Cold War. It's used when we think about Stalin's Russia. It's become such a famous case because it is such a kind of cautionary tale.
Cautionary tale is such a good phrase for it, right? Part of the reason why we revisit it again and again is not just an attempt to find an explanation, but to figure out how we can stop it from happening again. So he's writing The Crucible. It's first produced in 1953 during McCarthyism, right? So during the House Un-American Activities Committee's hearings, these are the anti-communist witch hunts in America.
And they're called witch hunts. We grasp for this. The shorthand we use for being accused of a crime for which you can't defend yourself, for a crime in which anything you say is never going to be enough to prove your innocence, is the witch trial, the witch hunt. And that is exactly how the McCarthy anti-communist crusade was described.
It's also a way of describing the hunt that is determined to find a guilty party, right? It's determined to find someone to blame. So it's a way of talking about scapegoating.
Yeah.
So for Miller, he points out that, and it's a brave thing for him to do in 1953 in the midst of the witch hunts.
And that's important to say. It's not over. He's not writing about something which has just happened and they're now in the
they're in their heyday. So he's doing it as an act of protest in the midst of the McCarthy hearings. He says this is a witch hunt. So he makes Salem a mirror for Cold War America, in which fear and accusation have destroyed any possibility of due process, which is what McCarthyism was doing. So when you simply denounce somebody and that's enough to get them tossed into jail.
And this is what's happening in these, the House of Un-American Activities. Is the only way people can save themselves is to point fingers. You're going to be blacklisted. Your career is going to be over. It's exactly the same dynamic. Yeah. And it is something where years later people apologize for what they had done. Yeah. Because they're trapped in that same mindset. It's them or me or them.
And people's lives were ruined.
Yeah.
There weren't mass executions, thank heaven. But other than that, a lot of it plays out in similar ways. And of course, Miller's play is hugely popular. It's the way a lot of people encounter the story of Salem for the first time.
Yeah.
And Miller's central point in the play really stands, right? It's a story about how fear is toxic, how it devours communities if you let it replace fact and evidence and due process. But it is important to say that it is also a piece of myth-making and a piece of fiction.
It's fiction, yeah.
Yeah, it is. So it's historically inaccurate in important ways, but again, because much of it is accurate, so that it blurs those boundaries, and so people think that all of it is accurate, and then they get mistaken conceptions. So one of the key things that he does is he takes Abigail Williams and he raises her age from 11 to 17. And he takes John Proctor's age down by 20 years because he's 61 in the history, but he makes him 40 and makes her 17. And then he puts Abigail in Proctor's house where she wasn't. She was in Samuel Parris's house so that he can invent an affair between them. There's no evidence whatsoever of them having an affair. And he makes Giles Corey, as we said last time, he makes him strictly a noble martyr instead of a complicated servant killer, tough old guy
who'd killed an indentured servant.
Yeah. So he's a very complex figure, and he removes that complexity and just makes him a noble martyr. But ultimately, as we're saying, the Crucible is a really powerful piece of playwriting to show what happens when that culture of denunciation that you're talking about, David, when that takes over.
I mean, the age of McCarthyism was when people had to stand up and not just denounce communism, but try to present themselves as the purest and of most patriotic they possibly could be.
Yeah, it's like an act of purging, right?
Yeah,
so
a purity test.
Yeah, it is a purity test. Again, you're in a binary system as the Puritans were. There's no allowance of gray areas. So you can't have dabbled in communism. You either are an anti-American communist or you are a patriotic, true-blooded American. And those are the only options. And you can't be a patriotic American who also wondered whether communism might be good for the country. This is not allowed as a political or as an innocent position to have taken.
There are no sidelines in these sorts of situations. It's with us, against us, enemies or friends.
Exactly. And it's also a story about confirmation bias.
Yeah. I mean, this reaches its most extreme and its most absurd and appalling under Stalin in the Soviet Union, when there was literally targets to be hit for people to be arrested, denounced and executed. There are minimum numbers of people who have to be discovered guilty of the crimes.
You said at the beginning of our story, David, the ways in which Puritan Massachusetts created a kind of proto-totalitarian community. A lot of it is the same logic and the same psychological machinery at work.
And the only safe place to be in that sort of totalitarian society is to be doing the denouncing.
Yeah. And that's why I say, that for me, Salem is fundamentally a story about scapegoating. You and I, David, we share a love of interesting etymologies of everyday words. And I really like the story behind the word scapegoat, which a lot of people, I think, don't know. And it's apt to the story of Salem because it comes from a Bible translation in the 1500s. The Bible story is that on the Day of Atonement, there are two goats, one of whom is sacrificed, and the other is driven into the wilderness, carrying everyone's sins with him. So that's that purity that you were talking about. So we'll be purified by having, a carrier physically take our sins away from us. And translated into English, the Hebrew word for this goat was rendered as a scapegoat, the goat that escapes. And that, of course, became scapegoat. So it's the innocent creature that is literally loaded with the guilt of the community and cast out so that the community can feel cleansed. That's where scapegoat comes from. And that's exactly what Salem did. It said that there were individuals here who would need to carry all of the collective fears and resentments and grievances and hostilities of the village. And in order to purify the village, you drive them out. And then you can be pure before God because you've scapegoated these people.
I mean, one of the reasons I find this story so difficult and so shocking is because one of the places where this happens most commonly in the world is the country I was born in, Nigeria. I'm a Nigerian citizen. I'm half Nigerian. And there are, as we speak, children who are being isolated in their communities, children being harmed, children being killed in Nigeria today in the 21st century. It's a phenomena that exists in other African countries. There have been reports written by UNICEF, by Human Rights Watch. There are aid agencies trying to help children. And if you go to parts of Africa and you see children on the street, some of those children are on the street because they've been driven out of their families and driven out of their villages because they've been accused of witchcraft. There are charismatic preachers who have made fortunes by ripping communities apart, accusing children of witchcraft in Africa in the 21st century. It is one of the things that most breaks my heart about Nigeria, about a country I'm a citizen of. It's an issue that is creating orphans in Nigeria and other African countries. It's an issue where there are powerful individuals for whom this is a money-making opportunity. I mean, literally thousands of children on the streets of African cities as we speak, because of accusations of witchcraft and because of a fusing of sometimes older ideas with different forms of Christianity. So as a Nigerian, this is a history that has very, very difficult modern cultural resonance. And we use the example and the metaphor of Salem and the idea of witch trials. It's a long time, as I said, since I read about this. It is so much darker, so much worse than I'd remembered.
Yeah, no, it is a dark and grim story in a lot of ways.
We've called it a cautionary tale. For a cautionary tale to work, we have to actually understand it, learn from it, and recognize ourselves in it, which is the hardest bit, I think.
I think that's the key, right? For me, it's the danger of letting division be the lens through which you judge everything.
Yeah.
And that seems to me to be so much of where we are today. And if we can at least pull back from that and say, if you let that happen, there can be really terrible consequences, then maybe we can save ourselves. The lessons of history remain, unlearned, but we keep trying.
Yeah. I don't know what else to do.
Yeah, exactly. It's the best we got.
It's this or,
It's better than not understanding what happened or not trying to learn from history. At least we can put it out there and see what people do with it.
This is historians longing to believe that we're useful.
Talk about confirmation bias. It must be true because everything collapses, David, if it isn't true.
I think I'm giggling because that's such a dark story we've just told. Let's keep giggling and call it a day there. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much.